Welcome to this session of the Morning Context Dialogue. We have Ashish with us, of course. We are today joined by Hetal Dalal. She's the Chief Operating Officer of Institutional Investor Advisory Services, a proxy advisory firm. So about Hetal, if you want to look up her professional qualifications, it's very easy to find. But I would rather go into a more personal take that I have of her. That she's one person who is a brilliant mix of ethical standards, what are the compliance standards, what's the technical standards. So if you listen to her, you will be on the right path, at least in the terms of meeting those SEBI qualifications of the listed companies. So that's why I've always valued her opinion above everyone else's. So welcome, Hetal.
You're being much too kind, but thank you very much for inviting me.
So I think we have already covered, you have already seen the kind of theme that we are going for. We want to figure out what are the learnings that you can draw from the Franklin Templeton saga. So I think the first question that I would come to you with, Hetal, is, institutional investors, the most important stakeholders for any listed company. They're supposed to uphold standards. On the other hand, we saw in the entire saga, whether it was looking at the debt of the corporate debt, as well as their own compliance standards of the managerial personnel. It was all pretty shady. You don't know what happened to their own governance standards. So what is your quick take on what went wrong? What could have been done better?
I think the way I looked at it is that it's essentially the Satyam moment for the asset management industry. You have, effectively you're saying that you have an event which has happened, which is fairly serious. From whatever the SEBI order seems to suggest, there were lapses in internal processes, in a lot of the sort of steps along the way. And to me, what it really comes out as, one star performer who's been able to override essentially the systems which are already there. The six funds together generated management fees of about 250 crores annually. Given the size of that revenue which is getting generated, you will have a star performer or a star team. And how the governance or the oversight around that is really managed is essentially the question. So to me, a lot of it gets driven by the entire management structure, the corporate culture, what has really happened around, governing star performers within a particular sort of fund. Is that something that we will see translating to every mutual fund? I wouldn't be so quick to jump to that conclusion. I mean, at this stage, I would look at it more as an isolated sort of event rather than saying that, paint it with a broad brush and say that this is essentially a problem of the entire asset management industry. If you look at how the asset management industry has reacted to, as you talked about, I'm just taking off from there, saying that, they are the ones who are supposed to push better governance standards.
Right.
I think if you look at it, or if you look at just the way we've looked at the corporate governance standards over the past, let's say, 6-7 years, we've turned 11 now, but really a lot of the work has been done in the last sort of decade. And the growth in corporate governance standards for, let's say, the top 100 companies, and we do this assessment annually, right, under the Indian Corporate Governance Scorecard, which we developed with IFC. So you evaluate the top 100 companies, we've done that over the past 4 years, and you'll see that the overall median scores have steadily improved. India is chasing better governance standards. Now, you may argue that, one is just, yes, companies feel that now they're getting bigger and, sort of getting a larger pool of investors. They have a much larger scope of stakeholders to deal with, and therefore having better governance standards, either through internal pressures or through external compulsions, is essentially the way to go. So by and large, we see that the overall governance standards have improved. A big element of that is the asset management industry, which has, voted on shareholder resolutions, provided pushback. In a lot of instances, the pushback is not public, right? There is a lot of conversation which even happens behind closed doors in terms of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what needs to change. And there have been transactions which have been impacted by some of these conversations. So the asset management industry, or just the institutional investors as a coterie, has done substantially well over the past, let's say, 2-3 years in being able to compel better corporate governance behavior. To that, I would also add credit to the media, which has been able to also articulate some of these issues very finely and keenly, and put that external pressure as well. So by and large, governance standards have improved. By and large, the asset management industry has been focused on some of these issues. The Franklin Templeton issue to me would be isolated, and I wouldn't be so quick to sort of spread it across the industry.
Uh, just to add on to what you just said, that you believe that it's an isolated incident. But however, if you see the way most of your AMCs have approached debt, corporate debt per se, hasn't exactly been kosher. They have acted
Sure.
as lenders rather than fulfilling their fiduciary responsibility towards investors. Uh, of course, there's also the problem that your corporate bond market is very shallow. But if you have to balance both of these issues, uh, taking care of your investor, having good governance standards, and the shallow corporate bond market, how would you rate all these three together? How does we move on from that?
No, on the debt side, there has been an aggression in terms of chasing. I mean, basically, they've been chasing yields, and there is a risk-reward trade-off. So higher the yield is going to be higher, therefore, the risk to that particular degree. Again, you will see some. Again, you would see some market participants, some funds actually chase those yields. And yes, because the bond market is shallow, this has become a bigger problem. I think the recent set of events has taught fund managers a lot. I don't think at the point in time that some of these transactions were undertaken, I think the risk was very clear, but that the risk would play out is something which wasn't really envisaged in this particular manner. And we can sort of chalk out everything to the COVID crisis and the market volatility and the loans against shares and all of that. But the reality is that these are risky products in terms of the way that they've been sort of embedded into some of these schemes. I think for the investors, the way to look at it is really to be able to keenly look at the risk appetite of that particular fund. I know SEBI's put out this entire regulation around first streamlining the number of funds and in terms of just the categorization of funds, and secondly having the riskometer out. I think just the fact that there is data available in terms of what kind of papers being invested in is something that investors should look at. And will that risk propensity on the debt side reduce? I think there are lessons which have been learned. And then to that extent, I think there will be a certain degree of reticence, let's say, in looking at products which have a significantly high appetite going forward. That's the way I would look at it.
Ashish, any questions?
No, so Hetal, would you be kind enough to sort of, if you were to sort of drill down as to the key takeaways from the Franklin episode, what would those be for you?
I think the key takeaways, well, I think the key takeaways are one, just the fact that Franklin Templeton has a global parent. You would expect that the global standards of operations and oversight and control and risk appetite, all of them would actually flow through the Indian arm, but it didn't. Let's face it just didn't. And therefore, just the fact that I think the big lesson is that just because it has a global parentage doesn't necessarily mean it will follow through on the same structures. That's very clearly being shown that there is a different governance standard for different markets, right? So to me, that's a big takeaway from the Franklin Templeton episode, and I could argue this across several other MNCs as well, but we're at sort of Franklin Templeton. So one is just that it's not an obvious conclusion. There can be differential governance standards across different markets, and that's something that investors should be aware of. I think the second piece of it really is that if you are sitting on the outside and when you're looking at a fund which is generating these significantly high returns, it's a simple risk reward trade-off, right? You have to understand that it's outperforming consistently year after year after year. There is no magic sauce beyond a point in the market, right? Something is happening. So therefore, just a little bit of keenness around, from a retail investor perspective, what's really behind the scenes in terms of this particular return. So not to look at it in a simplistic manner. I think the third thing definitely is the fact that, like I said, this is a watershed moment for the asset management industry. If you look at a lot of the responses that Templeton and its employees have given, it's more in terms of articulating what is within the confines of regulation and what is not. Uh, what therefore is likely to happen, and which has happened in the past, is that you're just going to see more regulation come in for asset management industry. The minute you stand up and say, well, this is not written in regulation, the reaction is going to be, well, let me write it in the regulation. So then you can't have the industry which continues to complain saying, there is a regulatory claustrophobia, so to speak, that there's just too much regulation, it's getting very prescriptive, and that, this is something which the regulator needs to sort of have broad framework. All of these are fine. But when you see these moments happen, there is a lesson to be learned, and nobody is going to, and everybody learns from these failures, right? And as do regulators. So I think my third take would be that this will drive newer and possibly more prescriptive regulations for the asset management industry.
Now, which is a problematic issue, right? The more prescription, the more loopholes.
Sure.
This has been like happening over and over again. I think it's more about the ethical standards which are not being met.
Sorry, I lost the connect.
Do you think it is more got to do with the ethics and how do you really take care of your own investors rather than having regulations and regulations?
See, finally, corporate governance or any kind of governance is about corporate behavior at the end of the day, right? A lot of that has to be embedded into corporate culture. If that's not happening, you will have the prescriptive regulation which keeps coming in. So I think for the fund management industry, one of the things they need to also call out is the fact that, why are the other funds, how are the other funds different in terms of the way they operate? And why is it that they don't expect an incident like this is likely to be repetitive in nature? In the absence of that clarity, you are going to see the prescriptive regulation kick in. That's my take at least.
Now,
the action of, sorry, Jashi, I'll just quickly come in. The action of the top management at Franklin, Hetal, something that we also sort of spent a lot of time reporting on with respect to the schemes. Is that something that which stood out to you as seriously problematic? Because when we were sort of reporting on it, we were, Franklin's view, and we were trying to sort of balance this whole argument saying that, it is not out of the ordinary, while we sort of viewed it as something that was deeply problematic. I'm wondering if you have a very clear distilled view on that.
Oh, you're going to get me in trouble, my dear. But look, you can't judge intent sitting on the outside, right? Intent is which is there. I'm assuming you're referring to the sort of funds which are pulled out, before the
right.
That's right.
The court was pulling out the funds before this.
That's right. That's right.
So intent is something which is in the mind. Whether you use the information to make that call or you didn't use that information to make the call, which is essentially the response which has been given to SEBI, is the individual knows best. Is there a series of events which seem to suggest a certain correlation between information and outcome? Yes, there is. Is this the right way to approach it? I would think that this could have been handled significantly better. Yes, I think that given the nature of the transactions which have occurred and the timeline that we're looking at, essentially, I would think there is a case that SEBI has to make. But all of this is finally going to become legal in terms of whether insider trading regulations apply to mutual funds, what is the definition of fraud, and it's going to become far more legal and get appealed. But to my mind, like I said, you can't judge intent, but there is a case that SEBI has in terms of just the sequence of events, in terms of when the information was received and what action actually took place. I think the final verdict will be what the courts and SAT will decide. I suspect this is going into appeal for sure. Yeah, I'm with you. I think the sequence of events tends to suggest that there are questions to be asked.
So we have one question from We have one question from one of the participants. His question, this is Karthik's question. He's asking, Rupa Kurwa has been charged with mishandling of funds, the same issue that we were speaking about. So should she be allowed to continue to serve on boards of Nestle or IIMA? Are you working with any of these boards on these issues?
Okay. That's fun.
Okay, fair enough. Look, at this point in time, there is a SEBI order that is clear. It's out in the public domain. I think it depends on how Nestle looks at its own governance standards, whether they believe that it will carry reputation risk for them. And this will go into appeal, and I don't think the final word is out yet. So I would still say that that is something that remains to be seen in terms of what the final outcome is. Should she be on the boards of Nestle and IMA? I think that's a conversation that Nestle and IMA need to have with her. And it depends on how seriously they take the situation at this point in time. Or do they wait it out and see and say that how this will play out, and then let's decide after that is another possible outcome that can also be something that the boards may consider. So that's really where it is.
So another thing was on this entire issue of most of the order, the SEBI order speaks about that how the corporate debt was handled on very oral instructions, that we had a verbal agreement, we had a verbal understanding, we had an oral understanding. How do you have a put and call option basis of verbal or oral understanding that, okay, I understand that person will return the money, okay, I will not evoke the shares, I will not evoke the pledges, which seems bizarre. Is it out of ordinary, or
yes,
do you really?
It is out of ordinary, yes.
Okay, so what more do you make of that?
So again, I'll just sort of briefly, when you say out of ordinary, like how does it normally happen is also my question. Like usually, what are the kind of safeguards which are available in the way that you're supposed to do this? And how far is the way that it was done at Franklin does this thing stand?
So look, without getting into some granular and rather boring technicalities, but any change to a particular instrument in any format, right? Either it is coupon, change in put call option, change in repayment dates, any particular change has to be documented. It has to be legally binding on both parties, right? Every debenture which is floated comes with an agreement. So there is an entire documentation which carries the terms and conditions of that particular debenture or any debt for that particular matter, right? What are the triggers? When will the repayment happen? Is there an accelerated repayment clause? So today you will find that a lot of lenders are saying that if there is, a rating downgrade, for example, and in fact, from what I understand, it's gone so far to say that if there is a rating downgrade on any paper of the issuer by any rating agency, it could result in an accelerated repayment. So you have these kind of clauses which actually come into any kind of, which are carried with any kind of debt instrument. For a mutual fund to invest in a particular paper, this documentation has to be complete, and it usually is. Any modification to, the terms and conditions prior agreed upon at the time of investing has to be therefore equally documented. There has to be a legality around it. I think these oral understandings or these verbal understandings are indeed unusual. It doesn't happen in the ordinary course of business.
Sorry, so none of the other sort of funds sort of approach it in any oral sort of way?
I can't commit to what the other funds do, but it is not what we consider normal business practice.
Okay. Got it.
Fair enough. I think I would like to move on to the other issue that was pretty much in the news cycle. That is on the PNB housing deal with Carlyle. So for all of us who have been a little bit aware of the news cycle, so what we saw is PNB housing and Carlyle getting into a deal, but the problem was on the valuation of the shares. Many other minority investors approached SEBI. They complained to SEBI saying that these shares have not been valued properly, and so the valuation of the deal itself is problematic. SEBI then issued an order asking PNB Housing to put a stop to the deal. PNB Housing went to SAT, and SAT then finally said, okay, you can go ahead with the EGM. However, you will have to do a valuation of the shares. So right now we are staring at a couple of possibilities, whether the deal goes through at all, whether new investors come in, does a valuation of the share happen at all? So now we have gone through what exactly is the deal about. So now let's come to the question here. So Hetal, my question over here is that this valuation of shares, this is not the first time that we are hearing about this. There have been multiple cases where no one has valued the shares properly. They have come up again and again. So do you think that at least now this is the time that a valuation of shares should be really formalized?
Okay, so on PNB housing, let me just take you back a little bit and set some context. What SEBI has said is that the structure is ultra vires the articles of association. Now you need a little bit of historical context to this, right? PNB housing was unlisted at some point in time. It was a subsidiary of PNB. PNB was listed. At that point in time, the article said that if you want to sell shares, you have to have a valuation, which has to be done by an independent registered value. PNB housing subsequently was listed. Now the legal standard doesn't require a valuation for a listed company. You would argue that the market will effectively decide what is the fair price, right? And therefore, the market did decide what was the fair price. There was a price at which the stock was languishing in and around 350, 400 kind of thing, right? I think so what SEBI is essentially saying is the AOA says that you need to have a valuation report by a registered independent valuer. And the reality is that once PNB housing got listed, they did not remove that clause from the AOA. So now it's become a legal hurdle, right? And therefore, SEBI is saying that you need to get for it to be compliant with your own articles of association, you need to get a valuation report. What SAT has said is that the voting on the EGM can continue, but you're not going to disclose the outcome of the vote until this whole thing is sorted, and they have another hearing which they sort of scheduled for in July. The entire angst of the minority investors, so to speak, is that they didn't get to participate in the equity raise. And that's a function of the fact that the stock price from the time that the deal was announced to now has significantly run up. And the deal contours are such that Carlyle actually gets into becoming the controlling shareholder, so to speak, with significantly higher equity than PNB. Now, we did a study of sort of several transactions which have happened in the past, and if you look at it, rightly or wrongly, 2 weeks prior to the transaction taking place, the stock price tends to react. Okay. You can debate why that's happening. I'm not making a comment on why that's happening, but that's essentially factual. And then depending upon the transaction, sort of whether it's the market likes it or doesn't like it, the stock will react further once the announcement actually happens. So there is a stock price run-up which has happened even in PNB housing at the point in time that this deal was likely to be announced. The price at which the deal is happening is under the SEBI formula. There is a formula that SEBI has, which has a historical construct based on how the market prices move over 26 weeks and 6 months. And there is
I think we lost you, Hetal. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I think we've lost her briefly. Let her get back. Yeah.
Yes, we can see you now. Yes.
Okay, let's shoot with this.
Okay. So no problem. So we were discussing about this stock price movement just ahead of the deals that you have seen, you have witnessed now in like almost all the cases that the study that that IS did.
Yeah, so essentially we've seen, so even in PNB housing, there is a stock price run-up which has happened. The stock price has reacted very well because, of course, Aditya Puri is coming in, you have Carlyle which is coming in, there is a change in control, and therefore now investors are saying that we wanted a share of the pie, which they're saying in hindsight. But the real nub of the issue that SEBI is raising is the fact that you need a valuation report under the article, which is a technicality. I mean, finally, if the stock is listed, you really need a valuation report.
Right. I think that's the major point, which seems to be the main issue here, because I think this is not the sole issue where people have, at least the minority investors have spoken about the valuation part. I mean, the stock price is the biggest reflection of that. So, do you think the debate of the valuation of shares has it kickstarted again, or do you think it's non-starter?
Look, I think valuation of shares is important when it's unlisted. I would worry if we started looking at valuation of shares when the stock is listed, because you assume that yes, the market is efficient, and that the market and the market sort of decides the price.
Hmm. So Arun Panikkar has this comment to make. He says that issue is whether control can be ceded at market price.
Okay. So the question you have to ask is the control being ceded to the extent that is PNB selling shares? PNB is not really selling shares. There's an equity infusion which is happening. Control is changing, yes. PNB has been regulated from a regulation standpoint. PNB cannot invest in. PNB has not been allowed to invest in this particular in this particular equity round, right? And to that extent, PNB is comfortable with that particular idea. It's seeing the sort of transaction go through. PNB has board representation. Is the question to ask is, are we fighting for PNB's rights to say that yes, they should have got a control premium and PNB itself is okay with the transaction? Or are we saying that the rest of the shareholders should have got a share of the pie? I think if you're going to argue that PNB should have got control premium, that's something that PNB and Carlyle need to sort of sit across the table and decide. They were equal partners at that point in time. If PNB is okay with this transaction, which you assume it is, given the fact that this is finally the government of India at the highest level, effectively a public sector enterprise, you would expect all the checks, all the check boxes have been crossed, all the approvals have been sought, and therefore the transaction is anyway going through. So that's the way I would look at it in terms of ceding control at market price.
I think I would like to circle back again to this the entire Franklin Templeton issue. The question I have here is about maybe the regulator's role itself.
Sure.
I mean, for a year and a half, we were speaking about the fact that Franklin did all of this because of COVID-19. And in fact, you see any of the SEBI filings in court, they also say the same. That COVID really activated the issues for them. There was liquidity in the market. And then after 1.5 years, they come out with an order where you're pretty much indicting Franklin on all of these issues. So that's a dichotomy, right? Over here in the court, you were saying something else, or in the order, you're saying something else. So what exactly do you think is the regulator's role in allowing this crisis to pan out for over a year and a half?
So look, the regulator steps in when this situation becomes egregious, right? There are several layers of oversight. The first level of oversight is simply management. You have, like I said, you have a global parent, you have systems, process structures, none of them working. You then have a board which is supposed to provide the oversight. Once the board fails, that's when the regulator sort of steps in. So I think to take the regulator to, at all points in time to castigate the regulators keeping at the wheel is perhaps not fair. I think there are layers of oversight which need to be taken before it goes to the level of the regulator. In this particular instance, it clearly has, and therefore, if you read the order, the regulator has raised the relevant issues around oversight and the missteps around.
Hetal, I just sorry, Jashik, please go on.
So just lastly on the oversight of the trustees, even that failed.
Yes, that also failed. So to that extent, but see, not again, you have to look at the fact that the board and the trustees. I'm not trying to sort of protect everyone, but if you look at it, the board and the trustees are outside the organization. A lot of what has been highlighted in the Franklin Templeton issue are internal issues. The fact that transactions are happening without any documentation, there are verbal agreements happening, the mid office doesn't have information, the so the front office is doing the transactions, changes are happening. All of this is a problem of internal process and structure and oversight. You have to question what is the internal audit doing, what is the kind of operations they're running, and those are issues which are far more, which are actually the main part of it. Should the board have asked the right questions? Yes, they should have asked the right questions. Have the trustees failed? Yes, they failed, and that is essentially why we are where we are. But a lot of it actually lies with the managerial responsibility as well.
Hetal, in the early part of the conversation, you were saying that a lot of the actions which now seem sort of problematic with more, I mean, they will all sort of fall under the ambit of regulation because there'll be a regulation about it. How do you see that panning out in more detail, if you could explain?
Look, today the regulations are all, a lot of the regulations are about disclosure, right? It's about saying that you need to publish your NAV, you need to publish ABC, you need to have a riskometer. All of this are there towards protection of minority interests. And if you look at what's happened in the corporate world, a lot of the corporate governance standards also started to that extent of saying that, sure, you need to, have voluntary compliance, then you're mandated to do ABC. What flipped for, governance standards for corporate India was the fact that you began to now empower investors to say that, you need to vote on sort of shareholder resolution for asset managers, you need to have a stewardship policy, you can now have class action suits. So all of this was one step towards empowering investors and therefore creating that external push for better governance standards. In the asset management industry today, you're looking at, yes, there are structures on what asset management industry can do, mutual funds can do, cannot do, the kind of paper they can invest in, all of that. There are disclosure requirements, which essentially are a form of enforcement, if nothing else. I think what you may likely see now is perhaps more strictures in terms of how these funds will operate, more internal guidelines, and perhaps to some degree, you'll also see greater empowerment of unit holders. Can unit holders get together and take action against mutual funds? So this is a likely scenario just as well in terms of empowering them.
Got it. So moving on to another news point that was there for the past week. So this is about the Adani companies. I understand you can't speak about, so Hetal is restricted from speaking about anything on the stock, but we wanted to hit upon the other issue of having a low public float. That's how really it impacts the company, and why as an investor, you might be a little wary of companies which have a lower public float. Plus, there is also the quality of your domestic investors who are in you, or institutional investors, foreign investors. So these are my couple of questions about companies which have a low public float.
Fair enough. So at a more generic level, right, when companies have a lower sort of public float, the stock price tends to become far more sensitive to transactions. You may say that there are a certain set of certain groups of companies which have low public float. I would argue that the public sector banks have low public float, right? You have the government holding, which in a lot of them is higher than 75%. Residual majority equity is held by LIC, so public float becomes pretty much minuscule. These are challenges of how the market is today. Your regulation says minimum public float has to be 25%. Within that, if you're going to see again a certain degree of illiquidity or lack of movement in that particular 25%, I think the one thing you should worry about is the sensitivity of that particular stock price to the liquidity available float. I'm not sure specifically what, and yeah, from a retail investor, I think that would be the thing to watch out for. Can that result in stock price manipulation? All of those issues become a lot more heightened than for a company which has greater public float, lesser sort of controlling shareholding. Those tend to have a lesser risk as far as stock price manipulation is concerned. Yeah, but I don't know whether I can make a comment beyond that.
Okay, I'll just try and push it a little, and obviously you can say no comment, Hetal. But what about financial institutions in Mauritius with the pensions to invest in these companies? Like, how do you?
You're talking about the Adani Group, right? You also have to understand one thing, that they are in businesses that investors don't want to own right now, right? They're in power, airports. All of these have a very high carbon footprint. It's natural for in a lot of the global and domestic investors to possibly shun them for some of these reasons as well, in terms of holding. Just because companies, I know Mauritius and Cayman Islands tends to sort of ring an alarm bell for everyone. From an Adani sort of stock standpoint, I can't make that comment very specifically. But by and large, this is also something we need to understand about the group. The rise of the group has also come at a point in time when there is the rise of the entire ESG philosophy for asset managers. So to that extent, you will see a much narrower set of investors who will be willing to hold a stock.
So coming to this entire piece of ESG, environment, social, and governance, which is another big, I would say, it's a trend or a fad, either of the two. But how do you look at this plethora of funds being launched one after the other? And I mean, barely it looks like exactly like a multi-cap fund. So what is your quick take on this entire piece of ESG?
I'm sorry, Jashi, I lost you. The connection was.
Is it okay now? Can you hear me now?
The connection was.
Yeah. So I'm just saying that what is your quick take on this entire ESG bit? Because you have so many funds being launched one after the other, the ESG funds focusing on only ESG companies. What is your take on ESG? That how we as India are looking at them?
So look, globally, there's enough research to say that ESG focused funds tend to outperform the main index. In India, it's still new. A lot of the funds have been launched in the, let's say, last 24 to 30 months. And the other piece of the puzzle is the fact that disclosures from companies are also developing. The fact that there is no uniformity of disclosure is a global problem, exists in India as well. But for Indian companies, they are now beginning to track data and begin publishing, and the data is not historical because they just don't have a long trail for it. So for them as well, a lot of the companies are doing some of these things right, but tracking, publishing, and getting comparable data is still a challenge. I think the regulators have started. They created a BRR report. Now they've created a much longer BRSR report in the hope that there will be some degree of consistency in data reporting, which will allow comparability across sectors or across companies. And perhaps that will provide a much more transparent mechanism from an assessment standpoint. But I must tell you, we've been working with a lot of the investors in terms of helping them with embedding ESG metrics in their investment decisions. And while scoring is not necessarily the way they go, I think they have themes and agendas, and they are definitely focused on engaging with the companies, sitting across the table and trying to find out what pushing companies to have a target around some of the ESG themes. So it's early stages, but I think it's an area which has significant potential as far as Indian asset management industry is concerned, as well as of course corporate care.
Ashish, you have any questions?
No, that's all from me, Jayashree. There's this person, right? I think you answered when Hetal wasn't there, Durgesh. He continues to be concerned whether he's going to get his money back in Franklin or not. I think that's what he's saying. That so far
he has got some 40% back. He's got some 40% back.
Yeah.
But I still think he will be able to get at least more than what he has got so far.
Yes.
I think, Ketan, my last question to you will be a very small question. Is on the IBC companies, your listed IBC companies, and how your equity shareholders, so regular retail investors, are getting stuck in these companies. They keep investing at the low points. The trading is not suspended till it's too late. What do you make of that piece? So
look. The IBC piece and the listing piece are two separate pieces. The linkage is at a very different stage. So companies being listed, and okay, let me put it this way. The companies getting delisted, there are two levels at which the delisting happens. One is simply penal, right? In the sense that you're not complying with trading regulations, there are violations, there's some sort of mandatory period after which the exchange itself will sort of delist the stock. And then there is procedural. Companies get merged into other companies. Companies decide they want to delist by themselves, and then they have the IBC kind of companies where the courts or NCLT will essentially ask the company to be delisted. That is the only time a company can be delisted. I think shareholders getting into equity at a point in time where the company is under IBC is a risk that the shareholders take. I simply looking at a stock price and saying that this is crashed substantially, let's buy it, I think is a fallacy of an argument. Can you trading earlier on? I suspect you can lines of IBC and LIN from a process and a regulatory standpoint, which isn't there. But having said so, restricting trading too early also stops people from exiting the stock when they want. So there are sort of, pros and cons to the entire story. But having said so, I think because we have a lot of retail investors on the show, I would only recommend that investing in equity just because the stock price is low is possibly dangerous. You need to look at some of these issues in a much larger context to see whether this is going to, what are the long-term implications of such an investment.
I think we have also, it's already 45 minutes mark. Any additional comments, Ashish, you have?
No, I think this was great, except for the bit of the internet connection. But
I'm sorry about that.
But otherwise, thank you so much for living through that difficulty and still doing this, Ethan. Really appreciate that you've been able to take time out to do this with us. Over to
Thank
you.
you so much, Hetal. Thank you so much, Hetal, for joining us. And it was a lovely interacting with you, and look forward to having such interactions more in future.
Yes, yes.